Welcome to Poets and Poetry, and thank you for joining us. You might wish to get pen and paper for information regarding this program, poets, books, or societies mentioned. If you have any questions, you can contact the phone number or email address listed before or after the program. I'm Leona Welch, founder of the Texoma Poetry Society, and we are a chartered member of the Poetry Society of Texas. The purpose of this program is to promote and encourage the writing of poetry and to kindle a finer appreciation of this creative art with introductions to poets reading their selected and often award-winning poetry. When the 2005 Poet Laureate of Texas, Alan Birkelbach, visited with us on October 1st, he offered a summary line that still lingers in my mind. He says it was not created from whole cloth, but was inspired by an essay, Can Poetry Matter, by Dana Gioia. He stated, "If we lose poetry, we lose our language. If we lose our language, we lose ourselves." There are as many kinds of poetry as there are words to describe, as there are poets who use the words, and if all else fails, invent their own. Today is going to be an awesome day of poetry because my guest is a master of the craft of words. It's a privilege and pleasure to introduce a longtime friend and award-winning poet, Wendy Dimmette. Thank you so much for bringing your poetry to us today.
It's my pleasure.
Before the reading, let's talk about Wendy. You and husband of 45 years, Dr. James Dimmette, make your home in Dallas. You are members of the Poetry Society of Texas, which both of you serve on the board of directors.
Right.
You are members of the National Federation of State Poetry Societies and Galaxy of Verse Literary Foundation. Are there other organizations in which you participate?
Poetry and the arts. We participate in that. And we try to attend one poetry retreat a year, like Ted Badger's Lucidity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. The literary organization.
I imagine the Poetry Society of Texas keeps you pretty busy.
It keeps us busy.
Wendy and Dr. Dimmette are the chairs of the Life Membership Fund, and they raise a great deal of money this year to promote and help our life members to be able to participate in the Poetry Society of Texas. I know you were born and raised in the small town of Delaware Bend. Yeah, exactly where is this, and is this a town or a community?
Well, if you'll remember history, all the settlers lined up with the rivers.
Uh-huh.
And that's what Delaware Bend is. It's like Big Bend and Fort Bend on the Rio Grande River. Delaware Bend was a community or a settlement, and Dexter was the post office for that area.
Uh-huh.
But Delaware Bend no longer exists. It's at the bottom of Lake Texoma.
Oh, how sad.
I know.
Sad.
It lives in my memory, though.
Oh, I can imagine. Tell us how you came to leave there.
Well, I never knew how to describe my father, either farmer or rancher, because he did a lot of both. He raised cattle, he raised pigs, horses, he sold pecans, he raised wheat, and so when he got to the point he couldn't do that work, we left Delaware Bend. We moved into Whitesboro, and that's where I graduated from high school.
Now, Whitesboro, I know.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, Probably the most obvious question for, or perhaps to, any poet would be, when did you begin writing and why?
Well, I started writing in 1978, and even I didn't know if I could write poetry, even though I'd always wanted to, but I write to find my own truth, to understand things, and to make order out of chaos and confusion.
Well, we all have enough of that in our life, don't we? So was it a concentrated effort to begin writing, or was there an event in your life that turned you to poetry?
No single event, but it definitely was a concentrated effort.
That I find that amazing with the success that you have had. What poet, if any, has been the greatest influence on your writing?
Well, I had studied Frost and Sandburg and all the poets they assign you in school, but when I started to SMU and I started reading the so-called contemporary poets, I really felt related to Theodore Redke. And I was so relieved when I finally found a poet that I felt that way about. But he uses such economy of words in his poetry. For instance, if he's talking about the futility of fear, he says every bush can't be a bear. And I find that I just like the way he describes things.
That's an interesting metaphor.
Yeah, and then he said, we all need what we hate.
Oh, now that's interesting too.
Well, I find him very interesting.
Oh. I've read that when Dr. Dimmette went back to school for his PhD is when you decided to also go to school. Tell us about your major and educational background, what you wanted to do with it, and if you have accomplished those goals.
Well, actually, I went back to school to finish an undergraduate degree. And by the time I finished it, he was midway into his PhD work and research. So I decided to enroll in the master's program. And that's when I had to find out if I could write poetry, because before that I was convinced I couldn't. I thought a poet was a long-bearded man that lived in an ivory tower and quoted Shakespeare. And even though I lived a rather isolated life, it was an ordinary life, and I was not schooled in the classics. So when I dropped out of college to get married and have 5 children, I left something uncompleted. And that's why I went back to get the undergraduate degree, and then the master's degree led to my finding out that I could write poetry, that it was all right for ordinary people to write poetry. So I went to see Dr. Perrine, who gave me permission to do a creative thesis. And he sent me to see Jack Myers, who became my mentor. And it took 2 years to write 60 pages of publishable poetry. That was the requirement for the degree. And As far as a goal, I had no goal except to finish my education. And I feel like every time that I complete a poem, I do accomplish my goal.
I know I well enough to know that you have taught poetry classes both at Eastville and Richland colleges. That should be goal enough. I want to throw a blindsided question at you. I promised I wouldn't, but I'm going to anyway.
Okay.
Wendy is also a writer of children's books, and she has written some children's plays. Tell us about your children's books.
There are 7 children's books, and I know this sounds like an old cliche, but I wrote them for my children, and they're mostly about my children. So I've also done plays. In fact, one of those books became a play, The List, and it was I wrote it as a Christmas book, but it turned out to be about a birthday on the stage. So, they have a license to change things.
Are the books still in print?
No, they're not.
Because I would love to have copies of that.
I do have one called Possum Parade in Texas. That was written for the sesquicentennial celebration. It was one of their products. So I do have copies of that, and I'll send you one.
I would certainly love to have one. I know that Dr. Dimmette doesn't write poetry. I've been fussing at him about that for a long time, and someday he's going to surprise me. Do any of your children write poetry?
Well, they're all very creative, but I have only one child that writes poetry, and that's the youngest. But she is a medical doctor, and she has 4 children, so she doesn't have time really to juggle.
Yeah, it doesn't leave a lot of time, does it? What about your grandchildren? Are any of them, I know you have several.
15.
15. Oh my goodness. I can just imagine Christmas at your house.
Oh, well, I can't.
Are any of them interested in writing?
No.
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 Isn't that amazing? They don't know what they are missing
I know.
with their grandmother.
That's
Do
the
you
truth.
write every day?
No, I wish I did. But on the days I don't, I try to go into my writing room and do something. Maybe vacuum the floors, dust, or straighten up. So I don't lose contact.
So just
Yeah.
be amongst it, so to speak. Do your poems just come to you, or do you pick a subject and then write?
No, I never had much luck picking a subject. And my poems just seem to evolve. I mean, it does have a starting point, and it can be something I hear at church, or when I work in the garden, or something somebody says. I like nonsensical, kind of silly things that turn into serious poems.
With the seriousness of your poems, I can't imagine you writing anything silly. It just doesn't. I guess that comes around to the question of where do you get your inspiration to write poetry?
It's usually something that really grabs my attention. I mean, something I hear that starts me thinking, and I have to explain it to myself. And poetry is the best way to do it.
Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts too. Wendy's manuscript, Learning to Stand Still, won the Edwin M. Egan Book Publication Award in 2002. And in just a moment, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing her read from this and perhaps other award-winning poetry as well. Did you put the manuscript together from poems you had already written, or did you write specifically for the manuscript?
No, the poems in that book are mostly the ones I wrote from 78 to 80. A lot of them were in my thesis that I earned the degree with.
I know within this book there is there are several poems that I gained a great deal of strength from a couple of years ago when my mother was very ill, and it was a healing for me, and I thank you for that.
I'm glad.
We're going to conclude this interview, but I would like to ask one final question. If you could speak directly to anyone in our audience today who has a wish to write poetry, what would you say to encourage that person?
I would say that no one, not even yourself, can know your heart until your words reveal it. So, shine those words and write. You can do it.
Well, thank you, Wendy, for sharing a part of your life and your insight to the language art of poetry. We hope you at home will stay with us as we go to the meeting of the Texoma Poetry Society, because you're in for a tremendous treat in hearing Wendy reveal her own words. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone to the reading portion of the Texoma Poetry Society. We are absolutely thrilled today to have as our guest Wendy Dimmette. For those of you who don't know, she was born on a ranch formed by a bend of Red River. She says that rich Texas land is still her place in the sun. The critics say that the words of her poetry are the rhythm of the river. In 1980, she earned a master's degree in English with a creative thesis in poetry under the direction of Jack Myers from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Jack is head of the creative writing department at SMU and a former Texas Poet Laureate. Wendy's poems have been published in numerous anthologies and books. Her winning poetry is forever in demand. I'm not going to list all of those. You have a handout, and I think I've mentioned that in there, as well as her children's books, which I'm fascinated by. Wendy has taught poetry workshops at Eastville and Richland colleges. She has read her poetry to high schools and libraries, and her children's stories to grade schools in Texas. She is a native Texan and has never lived anywhere else. I want to mention again, we talked about it briefly in the interview that we did. Her book, Learning to Stand Still, is a collection of poems which won the prestigious Edwin M. Eakin Book Publication Award in 2002. And I told her then, and I tell you now, this book was my strength a couple of years ago when my mother was so desperately ill. And I literally crawled between the pages and found comfort in her words because I felt like she was writing just for me. There are several comments on the back of the book. Jack Myers has written something Ralph Hammond, Poet Laureate Emeritus of the state of Alabama, Violet Newton, who's the previous winner of the Pat Stodgel book
I think every poet writes to understand the human experience, primarily his own. At this beginning stage of writing, our poems are very personal because they're written for ourselves. We are seeking a deeper way of knowing, for it's through honest expression that we find insight, clarity, and understanding, and finally our own voices and the words that are us. I think it's always been that way. There are other reasons for writing poetry, but that is my reason. And in the 10th century, a Japanese poet, Izumi Shikibu, expressed that revelation this way: watching the moon at dawn, solitary mid-sky, I knew myself completely, no part left out. It is in beginning to know ourselves that we begin to know others. So when we reach out and ask how we are like everyone else and how we're different, we're not asking, do you agree? We're asking, do you understand? And a poem, to me, is the best way of understanding someone. A poetry therapist, Dr. Jack Leedy, says, a poem is the shortest emotional distance between 2 points, the points representing the writer and the reader, or the listener. It's so important to be understood. I don't know about you, but if I can understand a person, nearly every time I like them. William Stafford was a big booster of reading to each other, sharing yourself by reading your poem and by enjoying someone else's poetry. And he wrote a ritual to read to each other. Part of it is, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. A poetry therapist, Nicholas Maza, says, in understanding we find hope. And he writes of that emotion. Hope is the belief that one hand reaching to another can eventually touch the moon, allowing the light to guide us through the night. Shakespeare knew how healing it can be to express our emotions. And he says of sorrow, give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, whispers the o'er-fraught heart and bids it break. In my book, I've written of sorrow this way. A distance that makes no difference. Some storms are big. They push you beyond the natural boundaries until all you have is something else. When I got there that day, a lizard, dazed by lightning, lashed by